Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar presentation, Inside the Attack, Understanding How Mobile Applications Are Compromised, brought to you by Guardsquare. I would like to introduce you to our presenter, Grant Goods. Grant Goods is a leading expert in cybersecurity technology with a uniquely broad and deep experience in all aspects of application security, ranging from code and data obfuscation transformation, white box cryptography, static and dynamic code protection techniques, and kernel or operating system level security. Grant has had years of direct experience at IBM, as well as other companies working on the deepest layers of both native compilers and Java VM and runtime experience, which he has brought to bear on the increasingly important app protection field.
Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar, and thank you, Drew, for that great introduction. I think that gives a pretty good overview of the kinds of things I've been working on. My career started in compilers and Java virtual machines and moved into software security starting in 2007. I think I just joined Guardsquare as Chief Scientist this year. So today's talk, as Drew mentioned, is Inside the Attack, Understanding How Mobile Apps Are Compromised. Our agenda will cover off what a hacker looks like, what their motivations are. We'll cover a couple of noteworthy mobile hacks, and we'll try to dig into why mobile apps can be vulnerable and what needs to be done to address those. We're going to go over some of the tool belt tools of the hacker and their techniques, how they attack your apps. And we'll try to cover off how you can protect your applications from those attacks. So I think everyone's familiar with the notion of large groups of hackers, as we see on the left, so a click farm, ranging down to individual hackers. But there are different types of hackers, of course. The traditional black hat hacker, the evil hacker, is motivated by gain, trying to do something evil. And then there's another category, the so-called white hat hacker, which is an ethical hacker. They are hacking to try to determine the vulnerabilities of things, to expose them to the developers of these apps and report those vulnerabilities so they can be repaired. There's also another category, which is a bit rare, but does exist, the nation state hacker. These are paid for by either by nations or corporations, or in some cases the mafia. And then you have another final category I would call the amateur hacker, which is actually the most prevalent type. These are just individuals who are playing around, having fun in some cases, in other cases causing financial damage. So it's interesting to consider the motivations of these attacks. Of course, we all expect that the biggest motivation is some form of financial gain. So in this case, we include things like direct financial gain, such as fraudulent access to a bank account. You're basically just sending money to yourself. But there may be less direct forms of financial gain. Personal information, including credit card details, etc., are actually, if stolen, can be sold on the black web, and the amount of money involved is not maybe very much per piece of information, but you can get a lot of information and therefore get a lot of money. And there's other even more indirect forms, such as in-game purchases, which can be stolen. They're not actually costing money, but they can be sold on auction sites and other places like that. There's also non-financial gain. I would say the category of just winning in a game, even a free game. You might think that nobody really cares if you cheated at a game, but the problem is other players of the game don't like the fact that somebody's cheating, and they'll stop playing the game. A good example of this was Pokemon Go, where the cheaters drove the new players to stop playing, and it had to be addressed by the creators of the game. There's also denial of service attacks, data exfiltration attacks, and a final category would be what I would call either recreational, malicious fun, or reputational hacking, where there's really not any financial or gain or loss, but it's really it is very common for people to hack to prove that they are great hackers. So we're going to cover off a few myths of application security, mobile application security. Starting with myth number one, which is that really mobile apps aren't a problem. All the hacking is occurring on desktops and large systems, because that's where people do their banking. Well, we know that's no longer true. People do often increasingly use their mobile device for all sorts of purposes, including things that used to be the realm of the desktop only. So in fact, 71% of all fraud transactions in the second quarter of 2018 were actually on mobile apps and mobile browsers. This shows this is a dramatically growing statistic. A second myth is that really, if it is a concern, it's all about the banking apps and possibly gaming apps. It's not really anything else, but that's not actually true. In 2018, 54% of malicious mobile apps were in the tools and lifestyle category, things like baby monitors, health, fitness apps, etc. And another myth is that this is really just a problem in places like China, India, Russia, where policing and criminal activity are more of a problem, but that's not actually true. America is not immune. In 2018, 24.7% of all mobile malware occurrences were actually in the US. And finally, another interesting number that Symantec reported in 2018, that an average of over 10,000 malicious apps were blocked per day. And now I'm going to cover a few noteworthy mobile hacks from the recent past. We'll start with 2017. There was an app called TimeHop, which was for social media aggregation. It was allowing people to monitor their various feeds from various social media platforms and aggregate that data. Unfortunately, they fell prey to a rather serious security hack that led to the login information of over 21 million users being leaked to the hackers. Now, it took over 7 months for them to detect that this had actually happened. So in that 7 months, all those accounts were effectively exposed. So this was very serious. From the company's perspective, the reputation was tremendously damaged. In 2018, Under Armour had a fitness app called MyFitnessPal, and it was hacked as well. And again, a large number of login details, in this case 150 million users, were exposed. Again, the reputational damage was quite severe. A somewhat more fun one, in 2019, McDonald's they have an app for buying products from them and for loyalty and for getting coupons. And they had a survey they wanted people to fill out. And if you filled out the survey, you would get a coupon sent to your app for a free soft drink. Well, some students in East Germany, in East Berlin, took a look at the security of this app, and they found out that it was very bad. It had an insecure protocol, it had missing server authentication, and they figured they could exploit this. And indeed, they were able to, using a very simple laptop and the app itself. They were able to place an order for an arbitrary amount of food and then set the price of the order to 0. They went up to the counter expecting to be told, well, go away, this is crazy. But the store said, here's your food, thank you for your business. They of course reported this to McDonald's, but it took over a month and a half for McDonald's to actually respond and fix the exploit. And finally, probably the most severe hack that I'll cover today, it's the Widevine hack in 2019 as well. So a security researcher was looking at the Widevine video player, which is under the Google banner, and it's used to play movies and other video content in browsers and in game consoles, etc. He was able to completely exploit the keys that are used to protect the movies inside the app, inside the browser. And now he revealed this to Google, and eventually revealed it to the public, partly to, of course, enhance his reputation as a security researcher. Now, you might think this wasn't so bad, because, of course, Google immediately would change all those keys. But the problem is that they rely on content providers, such as the studios, Netflix, etc., to get desirable content to put on their platform. And because they were unable to protect their keys, they suffered not just the reputational damage of the researchers' revelations, but potentially they would have been in hot water with these content providers and may even have been unable to get some of that content in the future. So these are all examples of, they are not generally as well publicized as some of the more dramatic hacks that occurred, malware and desktops, etc. But they are they can be very severe reputational damage to these companies. I'm going to cover off 3 specific industries where mobile app security should be and is a concern. I think the first and most obvious one is our financial apps. It's quite apparent that a mobile banking app is much more convenient than going to the brick and mortar store institution, but they also comprise a definite security hole or a security concern. In 2019, Verizon's Mobile Security Index indicated that 42% of financial service companies reported some sort of app-related security incident within the last year. It's also the case that fake apps which masquerade as the legitimate app and trick people into giving up their user credentials, are on the rise. In fact, in the first half of 2019, online fraud attacks via these fake apps tripled, and this was according to RSA. And our own research at Guardsquare reveals that less than half of the Android financial services apps use any form of app shielding or hardening. And unfortunately, that's a very bad statistic, because this is a key tactic for protecting your apps from being hacked. Another category that's, again, pretty obvious that is subject to hacking are gaming apps. Players desire to play these games either for free. Even if they are free, they may wish to get access to in-app purchases without paying money. They may also wish, in some cases, games have features which are yet to be released, and they're in the game, but they're only intended to be released at a later date, and they wish to gain early access to these features. And in some cases, they just wish to cheat, do better at the game than legitimate players. And as I mentioned earlier, the cheating thing, while not directly costing the company money, because it's only cheating against other players, eventually can cause players, the legitimate players, to feel that it's not worth playing the game and abandon the game. According to a story in VentureBeat, it was found that game makers lose around 40% of their in-game revenue from microtransactions yearly due to hacking. And I think another category of app and another industry that's very, very top of mind today with the COVID pandemic are healthcare apps. So these range from apps to control medical devices such as insulin pumps, all the way to fitness trackers. In the case of COVID, we're looking at proximity and tracking and location tracking for contact tracing. For hackers, this is generally about getting access to information, private information, the healthcare data. It turns out that you might think these medical records are really only of interest to the individual concerned, but there are a lot of sensitive details: date of birth, contact information such as address, payment details, etc. So it turns out that you can actually sell this data, and Experian reported that on the dark web, a complete set of medical records can sell for more than $1,000. So what are the characteristics of easy target apps? What makes an app a concern from your perspective and a target from a hacker's perspective? So I think everyone should appreciate that hackers look for low-hanging fruit. They're not going to generally try to attack a so-called Fort Knox app, the one that's well protected and is doing everything right. They look for apps that have vulnerabilities that they can exploit more easily. So the first and most obvious thing is either completely missing or inadequate encryption. Cryptography of communication between the server and protection of the data that may be resident on your mobile device is very much a key part of making your app secure. If you're not making use of cryptography at all, or if your cryptography is poorly designed, it will be exploited by the hackers. A second very important vulnerability are poor security protocols. These are the ways in which the client, the app on the mobile device, and the server communicate with each other. A typical example of a poor protocol is a lack of multi-factor authentication. It has become industry best practice to use multi-factor, and if you're not, you're probably vulnerable to some form of attack. And a third important category in general is insecure data storage. So if your app is storing data on the mobile phone or in the cloud on the server, but it's easily accessible, either sent in the clear or stored in the clear, or no attempts to protect it with obfuscation, this is a very big problem. And almost all apps have some form of sensitive customer information, and so that data should be protected. So with all of these potential threats, why are some companies opting out of securing their mobile apps? So there's a number of myths in this area. The first is, I think, that we don't want to slow down our time to deployment. So the reality is that mobile is fast, and fast to market is essential for mobile apps. We recognize this, and features need to be rolled out as quickly as possible to compete with the ever-changing mobile app market. However, this has been recognized for a long time as a potential problem. So there's something called DevOps style development, which allows for quick and integrated testing while the development process is going on. However, security is not generally as integrated into the testing. So that's, but just as there is DevOps, there's something called SecDevOps, which is allowing you to integrate testing into your development process. So this allows you to continue to deploy quickly while still having security. So it's not really the case that you need to slow down your deployments. Another myth is that our app doesn't contain any sensitive information. Unfortunately, that's almost always the case, that there is sensitive information. Unless you have effectively a toy app like a calculator or a solitaire game, you almost always have some form of login, some form of user account, and some form of information being stored about that user. So any user identifiable or sensitive data is a concern. Another myth is that security always comes at a cost, and that cost is generally slowing down the app or increasing its size. And almost always app developers are very concerned about speed and size. So a myth is we can't afford the security because our app is as big as it can be and as fast, it's as slow as it can be. It can't be any slower. But it's not actually the case that you need to compromise on speed and size to get security. There are actually some open source tools such as ProGuard, which in addition to optimizing your app, will also introduce security by obfuscating names. And in fact, even our Guardsquare's even our tools that you must pay for are able to introduce security with a manageable amount of performance increase and size increase. This is because our tools are easily configured and they are designed to minimize that overhead. Finally, there's a myth that, not a myth, I guess, it's actually the reality. We don't have any security engineers, and it's difficult to get these security engineers. They've become rather expensive and rare beasts. Everyone seems to want to introduce security into their development process, and trying to get security engineers to help you with those problems can be a challenge. And especially if you're a small company, you may not be able to afford a dedicated security engineer. Well, again, just as with the size and speed increase, I believe that our tooling allows you to configure security without extreme or even much expertise. We have made the configuration as easy as possible. Minimal configuration and minimal knowledge of what security is all about should give you a satisfactory solution. Okay, so I'm going to cover off now an interesting point, which is the hacking lifecycle. There's a little bit more to it than just people sitting at their desks clicking on keyboards as you see in the movies. So the first stage of hacking is reconnaissance. this is where you need, the hacker wishes to identify a potential target. This could be based on the potential for financial gain from that target. It could also be the likelihood that the security is poor in that target. So effectively at this stage, it's just investigating what's out there, looking in the App Store, talking to people, finding out what is a potential target. The next stage is scanning. This is a static analysis phase. At this stage, the hacker isn't actively hacking per se. They're looking at how the app behaves, they're playing with it, they're seeing what the user interaction is like, what the menu system is like, and they may do some passive analysis, such as monitoring server communication. They may unpack the app's code itself and do static analysis of the application code. Now, this may require some specialized hacking tools at this stage. Certainly, you cannot normally unpack an app from the App Store. You need to either root or jailbreak your device and then use additional tooling to get around the cryptography which protects the apps from that sort of analysis. By the time that they've finished the scanning phase, they have an attack plan in mind, and they need to now gain access to the app itself. And this is what I call the dynamic phase of the attack. At this stage, we're actually modifying the application code or its behavior. We may be modifying or injecting traffic into the server communication path. We may be modifying application data, etc. Again, there are specialized hacking tools that are used at this stage, and I'm going to cover a bit of that in my next slide. But at this stage, effectively, there is a hack in progress. This is where you might see some evidence of the hack progressing. But it's still a very manual and labor-intensive phase. The next phase is we call maintaining access. This is where you want to automate the attack so that it no longer is a laborious hand process. We would like to, as a hacker, allow for a wider and more rapid deployment of the hack. And we'd possibly even like to make it persistent, meaning that it's directly part of the app now and it will survive reboots. So the purpose of this is to simplify and broaden the deployment of the attack so that you can actually make money or whatever it is you're trying to do. And at the final stage is covering your tracks. So if you're expecting to leverage an exploit on an app for financial gain in particular, you need it to be broad and you need it to be relatively persistent. It has to survive for a length of time so that you can siphon off that money. You also need to survive detection, leave as few traces as possible for two reasons. If it was a banking app, you would almost expect that you would be discovered immediately by the fraud systems in place at the bank. But if you've covered your tracks well, maybe the fraud is not detected. Another thing, of course, is to avoid criminal persecution and penalties. If you can be identified as a hacker by traces you've left in your hack, then the police will eventually come knocking at your door. So what are some of those hacking techniques I referred to? I talked about some specialized tooling and techniques. So first and foremost, you should always keep in mind that hackers are lazy. They will always go for the low-hanging fruit, the easiest path, and they want to minimize their effort. So there are two types of techniques in general. There are static versus dynamic, or offline versus online. The static attacks are generally easier. You can take your time, and dynamic attacks, because you're interacting with the app, are more complex and difficult. The first and foremost attack technique is reverse engineering and code analysis. So as I mentioned, if the attacker can gain access to the source code, or sorry, to the binary code of the app, they can begin analyzing it for sensitive information, such as keys, credentials, and vulnerabilities or flaws in the design of the application. So this is always the beginning of any hack, is to look at the code and in a static form. Now, in order to achieve looking at this reverse engineering phase, you generally need to root or jailbreak the device. So rooting is the Android version and jailbreaking is the iOS version. And what this means is defeating the operating system's protections against examining the app itself and modifying its code. So you generally do this by installing a series of patches or using other tools. And then this allows you to gain supervisor or root access on the device itself. But once you have this, you can unpack apps, you can debug, you can modify code. So this is almost always the first thing that the attacker does. Another important thing that I've alluded to is debugging, which is traditionally used for finding bugs in code. This is what the app developer themselves will do. But in the hacker's case, they're using the debugger to analyze what the code does and when. So it's essentially a tool that you attach to the running app, and it allows you to inspect memory, look inside look at the code itself, and also modify the memory and the code itself. It's generally pretty challenging to use a debugger, but it is such a powerful tool that it is almost always part of a hack. So one of the things, as I alluded to, that the debugger can do is modify code and inject code. But there are other techniques for doing this. But of course, this is a key element of most hacks, because if the app was well designed, if you just ran it as it was, there would be no way to exploit it. But if you can modify the code, you can make it behave in an unintended manner, you can then, at this point, achieve your evil ends. So debugger is one tool, as I mentioned, but there are other tools that allow the modification of the code. Now, you may be modifying the code in memory, or you may be modifying it on disk, in the actual application bundle. And if you do it on disk, then it's a permanent change and it will survive a reboot. Another very interesting technique that has become increasingly easy to use and therefore much of a concern is hooking. So in the previous technique, you modify the code to achieve a goal, but that's relatively intrusive and very low level. Hooking is intercepting a function and diverting it to your code as the attacker, and then returning to the original code. So by hooking, it's very subtle, and from the application's perspective, it doesn't even know that this has occurred, but you can use that to siphon off data that the function normally would be passed. You can use it to modify that data, and there are various frameworks available for providing hooks into application code, which are very easy to use. In fact, any amateur could use them. And a final technique is I think I've alluded to it before, are fake apps. This is a very sneaky attack. It's basically you put an app on the App Store, or you install an app on a device via a phishing expedition or other techniques that resembles in every detail the legitimate app, and you trick the user into using the fake app and giving the credentials, say to the bank or whatever, to the fake app, and then of course that goes straight to the hackers. Okay, so I want to cover off some of the tools that are available. Now, there have always been tools for hacking. In many cases, they were handwritten by the hackers, and that was they were closely guarded, because the hackers, first of all, didn't want the application developers to be aware of what tools they had, and also it gave them the benefits over the other hackers. But increasingly, hacking tools have become free, open source, and readily available anywhere on the net. So each ecosystem, Android and iOS, has its set of free tools. So Android Rat and iSpy are two for Android and iOS respectively. Another very well-known tool is IDA Pro. It actually is a rather expensive tool, but it does offer a free version with limited functionality, and in many cases it is more than enough for hacking an app. Frida, and as the name suggests, it is free, is a dynamic instrumentation toolkit. It allows for hooking and other such things in a very easy to use manner. It's all programmed and customized with JavaScript, which is very familiar to many of the newer programmers, and it's increasingly powerful tool. And I think I would like to highlight probably the scariest one of all is Ghidra, which was produced by the NSA, yes, the National Security Agency. And it is effectively a free version of their internal hacking tools, because of course they are white hat hackers themselves. As part of their goal of defending the US against external hacking, they have to be able to hack themselves. So the Ghidra tool is an open source version of their internal tools. Not probably everything that they have, of course, but it is extremely powerful. It even includes artificial intelligence / machine learning elements. So it is very much a concern, or it should be, for anyone who's trying to produce applications that need to be secure. So what can you do about all of this? I think step one is you should always code for security. It should be part of your design. You should consider it from the very beginning of developing an application. Follow best practices. Use standard, well-designed cryptography where appropriate, including using standard protocols for communication, etc. And there are often open source free libraries for all of these things. You don't need to build it yourself. You should also just not do obvious dumb things. I think a good example is if you're expecting the user to enter a password, don't just hard code the password, and certainly don't do a string comparison of what the user entered and what the real password is, because then that string is in the code. You should actually hash the user's password and compare the hashed value, not the original string. Now, a second thing that you can do is to use some form of open source tooling, and in particular, ProGuard, which is an optimizer and is part of the Android Studio toolchain for Android. It's free. It optimizes your app, making it up to 90% smaller and 20% faster. So of course you would want to use this, but it also does provide some minimal protection against reverse engineering because it obfuscates the names of classes, fields, and methods. And step three is you should use some form of advanced obfuscation and runtime protection, such as RASP, for your application and the SDKs. This means considering tools such as Guardsquare's DexGuard for Android and IXGuard for iOS. If you've used these tools, the hacker will find it extremely difficult to get inside your app. And finally, what you shouldn't do is ignore the need for security. So I would like to thank you for your time and attention, and you can stay up to date with Guardsquare News and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn for some upcoming announcements and information. And I'd like to turn it back over to Drew for Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you, Grant, for that wonderful presentation. And we're going to start. And here's your first question. I get that security matters, but as an app developer, I don't see that as my responsibility. What should I be doing?
So it's certainly the case that you may not be a security expert as an app developer, but you should just be following these best practices, as I mentioned. So if you are considering any kind of communication protocol, please use the standard open source libraries and use them properly. So we're talking things like OpenSSL and TLS. Second of all, you should consider using an optimizer like ProGuard, because it will give you some protection and it's also going to make your app faster and better. And I think finally, you shouldn't you shouldn't be worried about using tooling such as DexGuard and IXGuard because you would feel that they're too difficult to configure. They are actually rather easy to configure. You can get pretty much out of the box some good security, and as I mentioned earlier, hackers are lazy. They will go for low-hanging fruit. If your app is protected and hardened and your competitors isn't, guess which one is going to get hacked?
Perfect. We have a question from the audience that reads, how can I prevent the user login credential leakage, which you mentioned in the beginning with your solution?
So user credentials, there are 2 or 3 ways in which they can leak. Of course, one of them is very obvious, lack of encryption on the communication between the client and the server. So you should make, it's again going back to a best practice, use good protocols, make sure that when you're sending a user ID password in an HTML message, you're not just sending it in plain text. But second of all, our tooling absolutely is focused on this kind of problem. So these sorts of things always involve strings and string comparison. Our tools are very good at encrypting these strings inside the application so that they're not visible in static analysis. In even resources and assets and other application elements can be encrypted. So if you make use of these tools, use a good protocol, you should be protected.
Very interesting. Another question from the audience. Does your solution protect from real-world daily threat scenarios such as malware, or just make reversing more challenging?
So in particular, malware is a slightly special case because it is often making use of operating system exploits. So if that is the case, our protections are directed at the application hardening of the application itself. So if it's truly malware that's making use of, for instance, some sort of escalation of privilege on an Android device, that may not be detectable because it's in the operating system. However, if the malware is doing something to the application itself, such as modifying code or hooking code, we can detect that. We have a wide suite of RAS protections, runtime application self-protection, and they are designed explicitly to address some of these more devious and complex attacks. So I would argue it's a balanced response. Not everything that in the malware world can be addressed, but if you don't protect yourself with some of these techniques, as I said, low-hanging fruit, you will be attacked.
Okay. Another question is, how does DexGuard protect the system calls of an app, the use of a key store, for example?
Good question. So yes, both of our offerings, DexGuard and XGuard, work on protecting system calls. We are in the process of fielding some advanced features in the upcoming releases. So some of these system call attacks are, we try to introduce indirection so that it's not as obvious that there are system calls. And another thing that we try to do is protect these shared library code, preloaded shared library code. We detect that people have hooked or shimmed this code. These are very challenging attacks to address, but I believe that our technology is state-of-the-art in this area.
Perfect. Another audience member is wondering if you could please recommend any free security course or website to learn security testing.
Well, I'm gonna have to punt on that one. I think I'm not really, I'm not sure what I would answer for that one. There are, of course, it is increasingly interesting. Universities are starting to take a greater interest in providing degree programs for software security and reverse engineering, and of course, I'm sure some of them have some form of free courseware that you can access. But I'm just not that familiar with that at this time.
Absolutely okay. Another question that came in is, where do you store keys for encryption on mobile devices? For example, keys to APIs.
So it's always a challenge, and as is indicated in my biography, I've worked in white box cryptography for many years. That's one technique to protect this very problem, to address this very problem. The keys themselves, if they are statically present in the app, they can be lifted, they can be found, they will stand out. We do provide encryption of such assets, and then then they must be decrypted at runtime and then used. So then the attack becomes a dynamic one rather than a static attack. So even without the use of white box cryptography, you should try to make use of relatively stealthy techniques in keys. So one thing to do is to not have a key sitting there statically, but to generate it using some form of computation. A good example is if the key, if it's a password, you don't use the password as the key, you do a hash or a SHA of the key, and then the digest becomes the key. So there are many techniques. I would say it is white box cryptography is a very expensive and heavy tool. Not everyone can afford it, either for cost, financial cost, or performance. But other techniques that I mentioned are probably the best things to start with.
Nice. Would you be able to speak to this question? What are some best practices for dealing with man-in-the-middle attacks for applications?
Sure. Well, this is a well-studied area, and that's where you rely on use of good protocols. In general, good cryptographic protocols and key sharing protocols, such as Diffie-Hellman, as an example, are designed with man-in-the-middle attacks in mind. They are proof against a man-in-the-middle. You would have to have access to one of the endpoints to get around a properly designed protocol. In general, man-in-the-middle relies on being able to monitor traffic and possibly spoof or inject modified traffic. If you've used appropriate protocols and cryptography on that traffic, the man-in-the-middle attack should fail. It's generally only because you've made a mistake in the implementation of that protocol that the man-in-the-middle attack will succeed, or if you simply haven't even protected your traffic between the client and the server.
Interesting. Another question, can we detect if our application has been compromised?
Yes, this is an area of great interest, of course, because it's one thing to protect your app and then fire it out into the unknown, and then several months later detect that, too bad, you were hacked. You would really like to know in real time that the initial stages of that hack are going on. So we do provide a lot of RASP, runtime application self-protection techniques, and you can instrument those techniques with your own callbacks. So by using such a feature, you can, in the app itself, detect that, for instance, a debugger has been attached or that someone has attempted to modify code. And instead of shutting down the app, you can stealthily capture that event and potentially log it up to a server or log it on the device for a subsequent session. That would allow you to detect that hacking activities are occurring even before, say, fraud or the hack is complete. Another thing that we have recently offered, actually just this month, is Threatcast, which is exactly designed to serve this need. It is a live server that communicates with your application, and as events are occurring, such as jailbreaks and roots, or debugger attachments or code modifications, you get live information about these attacks. Now, these are not necessarily actually fully realized exploits. These may just be hacking activity, or it may be as innocent as the person rooted their phone for a legitimate purpose. But you can still find out things such as the geographic distribution, such as which device, even which version of the device, which version of the app, which version of the operating system. All these details are communicated, and I think this is the future of application protection, is getting ahead of the hackers, being aware of what they're doing before they've managed to succeed in their hacks.
Speaking of application protection, another audience's member is wondering, can you protect application in runtime even if the devices are not rooted and you have no root access?
Is this a question that can people still exploit the app and modify it without rooting?
Yes, I believe that is what the member is wondering.
Yeah, so absolutely, this is possible. It's not. It would be considered an operating system bug, and I'm sure you're aware that, for example, Apple offers quite generous rewards to people who find exploits in the operating system that allow people to take a non-jailbroken device and still modify application data and code. These sorts of vulnerabilities, they do exist. Certainly, Apple takes them very seriously and is very quick to respond to them and close them down. And their reward program is intended to get advance notice of these exploits and vulnerabilities before the hackers are aware, and get the white hats to find them so that Apple can repair them. But unfortunately, these sorts of things do exist. So this is why simply saying, oh, I'm running on a non-rooted device, therefore I'm good, isn't really enough. It's still possible for, just basically due to bugs and vulnerabilities in the operating system, for hacking of that sort to occur.
Awesome. And we are getting down to our last two questions as of now. The first one being, does your solution provide capability to restrict fin apps from using camera or messaging data?
So to my knowledge, no. I would say that these are operating system capability features. If the operating system provides the feature, we can protect against some degree of modification of this, because it's usually in the form of within the app security parameterization. But unfortunately, as we are in the app itself, we are not interacting with the operating system. We do protect a certain amount of operating system code, but we are not able to enforce any of these sorts of restrictions unless the operating system already does so.
Good to know. And our final question today reads, can we detect app from root cloaking, like from tools like Magisk, etc.?
Yes, in fact, it's not sufficient. This is a cat and mouse game. Rooting and jailbreak exploits have learned that they can be detected. And their interest is the root itself may not care, because the person who created the root or the jailbreak is just trying to gain access to their device. But if the malicious users of these, the hackers, would like to conceal their tracks. So things like Magisk, yes, it attempts to modify the way that the root works, such that the traditional way of fingerprinting it or tracing it is not visible. So we are very aware of that, and that's it's an ongoing activity for us to make sure that our root and jailbreak detection mechanisms are not fooled by these root hiding techniques. So we keep up with all of these latest exploit hiding tools, and we do address them as they come out. That's just part of our job.
Well, Grant, thank you for all of your knowledge, and thank you, audience, for these wonderful questions. If you are looking to find out more about Guardsquare's resources, please look at the link that is posted into the chat panel. Also, it is www.guardsquare.com/en/blog. And with that, I would like to thank Grant for a great presentation. I would also like to thank Guardsquare for providing the audience with a great webinar. Lastly, thank you to everyone who attended today. We hope you learned something new that will help you in your developer career. Thank you, and be safe out there.